I appreciate so much the opportunity to be with you this evening, and I appreciate the subject that has been assigned to me as we deal with this evening with the subject of marriage and looking at Genesis chapter 2. And I appreciate the series that you have lined up, and it looks like a good series. And I got to listen just a little bit, not much, of Nathan's study last week. But anyway, I'm glad to be here this evening. So I encourage you to get a Bible and turn with me to Genesis chapter 2. That's where we're going to spend our time this evening. We'll look at some other passages, but we're going to be looking at some other things related to that. I want us to back up, though, a little bit and get a bird's eye view of Genesis chapter 2. And Genesis chapter 2, for my own study, I call it Man in the Garden. And what we see in Genesis 2, we have the first 7 verses dealing with creation being finished and God resting on the seventh day. Well, then the rest of the chapter is about man being in the garden, beginning at verse 8 through the end of the chapter, which is verse 25. We have man in the garden. We have a description of the garden, verses 8 to 14. And then we have man's work in the garden at verse 15. Notice at verse 15, that the Lord put him in the garden of Eden to tend and to keep it. So here is the work that man was to do in the garden. Well, you're familiar with verses 16 and 17, the law that of what he could and could not eat while in the garden, that he could eat of any tree, but there was a particular tree he could not eat, and in the day that he did it, he would surely die. Well, the next section, verses 18 to 25, is our focal point this evening. The creation of woman, I call it here, or the beginning of the marriage relationship. That begins at verse 18. We're going to begin reading there in just a second. Here's what we see in Genesis chapter 2. This is the beginning of the home. This is the beginning of marriage. This is the beginning of the family relationship. And so that home that you have, that marriage you have, the family relationship that you have, this all began right here in Genesis chapter 2. It didn't begin in chapter 1. It begins right here in chapter 2. So what we're going to do tonight is look at some principles that we learned from Genesis chapter 2. We're going to list a number of things we learned right here from this context. So let's read together, looking at Genesis chapter 2, beginning at verse 18. And the Lord God said, "It is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him. And out of the ground the Lord formed every beast of the field and every bird of the air and brought them to Adam to see what he would call them. And whatever Adam called each living creature, that was its name. So Adam gave names to all the cattle and the birds of the air and every beast of the field, but for Adam there was not found a helper comparable to him. And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam, and he slept, and he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh in its place. Then the rib which the Lord God had taken from him, he made into a woman, and he brought her to the man. And Adam said, This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed." Now, in Genesis chapter 2, let's begin listing some lessons that we just learned from that reading, and we're going to look at those verses time and again this evening. Here's the first thing I learned from this context. I learned, first of all, that marriage is divine in its origin. I learned that marriage is divine in its origin. Now, when I suggest it's divine in its origin, marriage is either divine in origin or it is not divine in its origin. And we conclude that because of the law of excluded middle. There are some things where there is no middle. It either is or it is not. So marriage is either of divine origin or it's not of divine origin. You can't have it both ways. It's of divine origin and it's not. It's either is or it isn't. If it is of human origin, then that means concerning marriage, there are no rules to be bound upon that marriage relationship. And furthermore, man and woman can do as they please. They can do whatever they want, however they want, marry who they want, marry what they want, because there are no rules. Marriage has been designed by man. On the other hand, if marriage is of divine origin, then God has the absolute right to set the guidelines. So if God created marriage and it's of divine origin, then God sets the guidelines for the marriage relationship. May I suggest to you that evolutionists and humanists argue that marriage is the result of a long line of evolutionary development of biological creatures forming pairing relationships. Their concept of marriage is that as man began to develop and creatures began to evolve, that over time you would have a male and maybe a female develops, and then they finally pair with one another. And so there was this natural pairing of each other, but they chose for themselves to do that. And it was not something that God designed, because there is no God and there was no creation. I suggest to you there's no evidence of that at all. But let's look at evidence that marriage is of divine origin. 3 things I want to suggest to you about that. First of all, the Genesis record shows that God instituted marriage. So let's go back to Genesis chapter 2. Look at verse 18. I want you to notice at verse 18 that God said, "It is not good that man should be alone, and I'll make him a helper comparable to him." I want you to see that it was God's idea to make a helper comparable for Adam. This was not man's idea. We'll say that again here in a moment, making another observation about that. But this was not man coming to God and suggesting to God, "I need a helper comparable to me." But it was God who had the idea, "You need a helper comparable to you." That tells me marriage is of divine origin. Now, verse 21 says that God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and from the rib he closed up the flesh, verse 22, and from that he made it into a woman. Verse 22 says he brought that woman to man and presented her to him. And notice Moses' comment by inspiration about this marriage relationship. I say this is Moses' comment. Commentators sometimes are varied. Some suggest this is Adam still talking from verse 23. I think it's probably Moses' comment, because the reference to man leaving his father and mother, Adam did not have a father and mother to leave. This is Moses' comment by inspiration about the marriage, and that is, "Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." God's law on marriage. So what I'm learning from the Genesis record is that God instituted, it was his idea concerning this marriage relationship. Now let's go over to Matthew chapter 19 just quickly. And notice in Matthew chapter 19, and beginning at verse 4, that Jesus, all I want you to see here, we're going to look at Matthew 19 a little bit later, is that Jesus endorsed this account. And what I want you to learn from this before we go back and look at the text, Jesus, who was raised from the dead and proven to be the Son of God, here's what he says concerning this account. "Have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said," that is, the Creator said, "For this reason shall a man leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." He's quoting Genesis 2:24, which tells me that Jesus endorsed that account as being real and true, and endorsed that account. So I'm learning from that that God, the record shows, instituted marriage. But let's go a step further. I want you to understand that marriage is universally practiced. Is evidence that indeed that it was something not of human origin, but of divine origin. I want to suggest to you that Dr. Ashley Montague said, he was a prominent anthropologist, said there is no societies in which marriage does not exist. I challenge you to find that that's not true, find evidence that that's not true. There is no society in which marriage does not exist. Now keep this in mind, that if marriage developed in a random, haphazard, evolutionary formation, so that it begins to evolve as man evolved over millions of years, what you would expect is that you would find marriage in one culture, but yet not developed in another culture. But that's not the case. Marriage is in all cultures. There is not a society in which marriage does not exist. That argues for the divine institution of the marriage relationship. May I suggest to you a third evidence that it's of divine origin, and that is the historical record of marriage. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 2. I cite Genesis 2 as a historical record. You say, well, if you reject the Bible, you're not going to accept the Bible at all, but it is a historical record. Even those who reject it acknowledge this is a historical record. They might not agree with it, but it is a historical record. And this historical record being endorsed by Jesus said, "He that made them at the beginning made them male and female," and then he quotes the marriage law. So here is an historical record that says marriage was part of the history of man since the beginning of time. The Code of Hammurabi, which dates back to 2100 BC, that had 282 laws, 34 of those 282 laws dealt with marriage. So 2,100 years before Christ, there were laws concerning marriage relationship. All of that suggests that marriage is divine in origin. Now, before we go further, may I make an application on that? And that is anything that we do that destroys the concept of marriage, anything we say that belittles marriage, anything that we say that suggests that marriage is not good is a reference to something that God has created. We're going against the divine plan. God, in his divine plan, created marriage relationship. So I learned that it is divine in its origin. Here's a second lesson I learned about marriage from Genesis chapter 2, our text right here. And I learned that marriage is good for man. We make all kinds of jokes about someone getting married, that things are much better before you get married than when you get married. And this is the last days of your liberty and your freedom before you get married. And when we put all of those jokes aside and get serious, we have to understand that marriage is good for mankind. Now let's go back to Genesis 2 and notice in verse 18. Let's go back to Genesis 2. Perhaps you've gone over to the book of Matthew as we traced our way over there. So let's go back to Genesis chapter 2, and in verse 18, we read in the text that God said, "It is not good that man should be alone." Now what's interesting to me, that this is in the context of God repeatedly saying things were good. Now let's go back to Genesis chapter 1 and verse 4. I want you to get a sampling of those verses I have on the screen. In the day of creation, you notice this in chapter 1 from last week, that God saw the light and it was good. Verse 4. Drop down to verse 10. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters the sea, and God saw that it was good. Well, let's go on to verse 12. And again, you see God saw that it was good. Drop down to verse 18. God saw that it was good. Look at verse 25. And God saw that it was good. Look at the end of the chapter, verse 31. That God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. So repeatedly, God had made something, it's good, and this is good, and this is good, and this is good, and this is very good. Then notice the first time he ever says this is in chapter 2 and in verse 18. He said, "It is not good that man should be alone." Here's something not good. I created light, and that's good. I separated the earth and the seas, and that's good. I looked at everything I made, and it's good. But here's man, he's all alone. That's not good, he said. That's interesting. Not good for man to be alone. Now again, I remind you of this principle. This was God's assessment, and this was God's judgment, and not man's plea. And if this were your first reading of the book of Genesis, and you saw that God created man, and then man comes to God and pleads to God saying, "You haven't created a companion for me. Please make me a companion." That wouldn't surprise you, would it? But that's not what happened. This was God's assessment, and this was God's judgment. It's not good that man should be alone. This text is not saying that it is wrong to be single. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 1, Paul said it's good for a man not to touch a woman. He's talking about having a relationship with her. And then he says at verses 7 and 8 that it would be good that the men remain even as he was, that is, he's single. So he was certainly not a married man, and was arguing that under the present circumstance, the present distress, that was best. So Genesis 2 and verse 18 is not saying that it's wrong to be single, but it does suggest that marriage is the answer to some problems. Like Genesis 2, the problem of loneliness. Not good for man to be alone. Secondly, chapter 7 and verse 2 of 1 Corinthians, in order to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife and every woman have her own husband. It's the answer to the problem of fornication. In 1 Timothy 5:13, it was the answer to idleness and gossip, that it would be better for these widows to marry and bear children, the text says. So it's the answer to some problems. But let's go further. Go back to verse 18. God said, "I will make him a helper comparable to him." What is he talking about? It's not good that man should be alone. So here's what I'll make. I'll make him a helper comparable to him. The English Standard says, a helper fit for him. And the footnote says, corresponding to him. I'm going to make him a helper that corresponds to him. The New Century Version said, a helper who is right for him. The New American 95 says, a helper suitable for him. The NET footnote, or the text note, says That indispensable companion. I like that. I'm going to make him an indispensable companion that he needs. It's not good that man shall be alone. I will make him an indispensable companion. Now, I want you to notice this in verses 19 and 20. To turn you to Genesis 2, 19 and 20. When God said, I will make him a helper comparable to him. Again, if this was your first reading of the text, you would not be surprised then if the text jumped immediately and said, God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh thereof, and out of it he made a woman. That's not what the text says. What I want you to notice, verse 19 said, God made animals, and Adam named them. It almost seems like things are out of sequence, don't they? Wait a minute, I thought we were talking about man needing a companion, and now he jumps to God making animals for him. There's a purpose behind that. Notice verse 19 before we go to the screen. That out of the ground the Lord formed every beast of the field and every bird of the air and brought them to Adam to see what he would call them. And whatever Adam called them, that was the name. And he gave names to all the cattle and the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. But for Adam there was not found a helper comparable to him. What am I learning from that? As Adam named them, he had to notice there's a male and female counterpart with every animal he looked at and he named. So God brings this animal in, and he notices this is a male and there's a female. There seems to be companionship. Here's another animal. There's a male and a female. Here's another animal, male and female, and another one, male and female. But what Adam noticed, there wasn't one for him. For every male I see, there's a counterpart in the animal, but there's not one for me. And furthermore, I want to suggest to you, how do we go back here? What I want you to notice right here in verse 19 is that, here we go, that God paired the animals before Adam so he could fully understand his need for companionship. Now go back and look at the text, and we'll come back to the screen. Look at verse 18. That it's not good that man should be alone. I'll make him a helper comparable for him. And then the focus turns to the animal kingdom. Adam, here's the animals. You named the animals. And there's more than just getting names for the animals, but notice, Adam, that each one has a companion. You don't have one. You don't have one. God had paired the animals so Adam could fully understand he had no companion and that he was all alone. Here's what I'm learning from that man better appreciates marriage when he understands the loneliness of being without a mate. And Adam saw that. So God said, I'll tell you what, I'll make a helper comparable for him. Now let's go to verse 21 and 22. God took one of his ribs. And from that, verse 21 says he made into a woman, the text says. 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 9 says that man was not created for the woman, but the woman for the man. That's interesting, isn't it? What this shows is that she is part of him. Could God have taken the dust of the ground and made into a woman? Certainly he could have done that. He could have done anything he wanted. But God took the rib from a man and made that rib into a woman to demonstrate she's part of him. He now views her as his own flesh. In fact, in Ephesians chapter 5, a man is to love his wife as his own flesh. She's part of him, is the argument that's being made. She's equal to him. She's corresponding to him, or she's suitable for him. She's his missing part, is what he's demonstrating to Adam. God made a woman. Now look at verse 23. Adam's reaction shows that marriage is good. That's what we're arguing for, that marriage is good for man. What is Adam's reaction? He said, now this is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She should be called woman, for she was taken out of man. What's interesting, these are the first recorded words of man. I don't think they were the first words because verses 19 and 20 says he was naming the animals, but I don't have a record of that. I don't know what he said. But I do know what he said here. And the first recorded words of man was extolling his wife. Isn't that interesting? That the text says, he said, this is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. He is saying, she is part of me. We're made of the same stuff. That's what he's saying. This is bone of my bone, and this is flesh of my flesh. Now notice the wording at verse 23. This is now bone of my bones. I like the English Standard rendering of that. don't know what keeps happening. My buttons keep sticking or something here. The English Standard rendering of that said, "This at last is bone of my bones." In other words, he looks around at the animal kingdom and he notices, but there's no companion for him. But this at last is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one and no other is bone of my bones, he says, and flesh of my flesh. Now, here's another lesson I'm learning from this same context. Marriage is heterosexual. I learned that marriage is divine in origin, marriage is good for mankind, but marriage is heterosexual. I learned that from Genesis chapter 2. I want you to notice that God made male and female. We all know that, but we need to understand that. And the reason we need to understand that is we're being bombarded in our society that you can have male or you could have female, and then you might have some other gender that you don't really know what it is. It's kind of hard to tell what's what. And that you can marry whoever you wish, but I want you to notice that marriage is heterosexual. God made male and female. Now let's go back to Genesis 2. We won't read the entire account, verses 18 to 25, but I want you to notice the words that I've emphasized about man and woman. God said it is not good that man should be alone. That's man, male, because that's what Adam was. Woman hadn't been created at this point. Now let's drop down to verse 22 now and notice that God made the rib into a woman. So now I have a man and a woman. Verse 23 says, she shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. So we have man, we have woman. And notice verse 25, they were both naked, the man and his wife. So we have man and woman, and we have man and his wife. Now let's go to Matthew chapter 19, where Jesus comments upon them, and he said, he that made them at the beginning made them male and female. That's what God made, that's what God created. And he quotes in the context of Genesis chapter 2. Now I want you to notice that the mate that God chose for Adam, a male, was Eve, a female. The mate that God chose for Adam, being a male, was a female. Other relationships are forbidden. There was a time we didn't have to emphasize this, where this was understood. This principle has to be driven home. Let's go to Romans chapter 1. Same-sex relationships are forbidden in both the Old and New Testaments, but I want to go to the New Testament now, Romans chapter 1, and I want you to notice the sins of the Gentiles, verses 26 and 27, as Paul is enumerating, here's what's wrong with the pagan society. It makes them guilty of sin and in need of salvation was they were given to homosexuality. Notice verse 26, for this reason God gave them up to vile passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use, which is against nature. Likewise, the men leaving the natural use of the woman, burning in their lust for one another, men with men committing what is shameful, receiving in themselves the penalty of their error which was due. What am I learning from that? When men were with men and women were with women, God said it was against nature, and it indeed is shameful. Look over with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 6. The Corinthians were converted out of a pagan society that was given to all forms of hedonism. And that is, they were given to whatever pleasure they wanted to engage in. There were fornicators, there were adulterers, there were homosexuals. Look at verse 9. Do you not know the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither fornicators, idolaters, nor adulterers, nor homosexuals, nor sodomites. And then notice at verse 11, he said, and such were some of you, but you are washed and sanctified and justified in the name of the Spirit and by the Lord and by the Spirit of our God. So same-sex relationships were forbidden, and furthermore, sexual relationships with animals were forbidden. Let's go to Leviticus chapter 18. Go to Leviticus chapter 18. And I want you to notice at verse 23, Leviticus 18, verse 23, you shall not mate with any animal to defile yourself with it, nor shall any woman stand before an animal to mate with it. It is a perversion, he said. Now let's drop over a couple of chapters, chapter 20 and in verse 15. Leviticus 20 and verse 15, if a man mates with an animal, he shall surely be put to death, and you shall kill the animal. Well, we see the same thing over in Deuteronomy, but I want to go back to Genesis 2 and in verse 20. Genesis 2 and in verse 20 implies bestiality is not in harmony with God's plan. Let's go back to Genesis 2. You perhaps have left there to go to our text that we're tracing. Look at verse 20. God gave names to all the cattle and the beasts of the field and birds of the air, but for Adam there was not found a helper comparable to him. There was nothing found in the animal kingdom for him, so God said, I'll make him a helper comparable to him. So other relationships were forbidden. Marriage is a heterosexual relationship. Let's go back to chapter 1 from your study last week. In verse 26 and 27, God, in creating man, said, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. And I want to suggest to you that the inability to reproduce shows the same-sex relationship is contrary to God's plan. So what am I learning from Genesis chapter 2? I'm learning that marriage is heterosexual, but that's not all. Here's another lesson I'm learning from Genesis chapter 2, and that is marriage is monogamous. Marriage is monogamous. What do we mean by that? Well, God made one man for one woman for life. Genesis 2:24. For this reason, shall a man leave his father and mother and be joined unto his wife, and they shall become one flesh. God did not make marriage for a man and his wives, nor did he make marriage for a woman and her husbands, but God made them male and female. Now let's go back to Matthew chapter 19 in verse 5. Do you not know that he which made them at the beginning, notice what the text says, made them male and female, not male and females, or males and female, but God made them male and female, and said, for this reason shall a man leave his father and mother. What I'm learning from that is that Jesus endorsed monogamy. Marriage is monogamous. So therefore, polygamy is wrong. Now, why do I need to emphasize that? Well, I want to tell you, I've had even some brethren raise the question with me. Can you show me where polygamy is specifically condemned in the Bible? You think about that. Can you show me where polygamy is condemned? Well, what that implies is God hasn't condemned polygamy. Genesis 2:24 is one of those passages that would condemn it. Matthew 19 would be another. I'm being told that some brethren who've been backed into a corner on divorce and remarriage, as they argue that those who are in an adulterous marriage can stay in that marriage even after they obey the gospel, when we ask them, well, what about those that are in a polygamous relationship? They'd have to abandon their argument or buy into they can keep their polygamy. Some have bought in, well, maybe they could keep their mates, plural. And so that's why we need to emphasize that polygamy is wrong. Polygamy is sinful. Now let's go back to Genesis chapter 4 for a moment. I want you to see that polygamy is rebellion. How so? Well, let's go to Genesis chapter 4. You'll get to Genesis 4 a little bit later on in your studies. So I'm going to get ahead and steal some thunder from a future lesson. And I want you to notice that Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, the text says. You remember he killed his brother. And as he rebels against God, he went out from the Lord, the text says. Well, that verse and the next following verses that we're going to look at, his descendants followed in that same rebellion. Notice verse 19, that Lamech took to himself 2 wives. Now, unless I've missed something, that's the first reference to polygamy in the Old Testament, in history. There may have been something before, but I've missed it. But I think that's the first reference to polygamy. We're only 4 chapters, so it didn't take a lot of searching to find out if that's true or not. But here is the case of polygamy in the 4th chapter. And we've only got it, we didn't even make it all the way through chapter 4, and a man has taken 2 wives, the text says. He's part of the family of rebellion as Cain went out from the presence of the Lord. Listen to what H.C. Leupold said. He said up to this age, the original purpose of God in creating one man for one woman and uniting them in marriage had apparently been understood as sanctioning only monogamous marriage. In the 7th generation from Adam comes a man in the line of the Cainites who dare to fly in the face of this divine institution. Interesting, isn't it? Just 7 generations from Adam, here's a man who's ready now to fly in the face of the divine institution that it's one man for one woman for life, and he takes him 2 wives. What I'm learning from this is that marriage is monogamous. Marriage is the exclusive outlet for sexual fulfillment. Marriage is the exclusive outlet for sexual fulfillment. You say, where do you learn that? Well, let's go back to Genesis chapter 2 now and look at verse 24. Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they two shall become one flesh. And we'll talk about that one flesh relationship in a moment. But suffice it to say, everyone will agree that involves the intimate relationship. Where it involves more or not, it's another question. We'll come to that. But Genesis 2:24 tells me that. Marriage is honorable, the Hebrew writer would say, verse 4, and the bed undefiled. The bed meaning the marriage bed, that is the sexual relationship, takes place in the marriage. But the fornicator, that is before, and the adulterer, that is outside of marriage, God will judge or condemn. Takes place in the marriage relationship. To avoid fornication, Paul would say, 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 2, let every man have his own wife and every woman have her own husband. So I'm learning from that marriage is the exclusive outlet for sexual fulfillment. Here's another lesson I'm learning from the same context of Genesis chapter 2, and that is that marriage is a permanent relationship. Marriage is a permanent relationship. Now, I want you to notice that Jesus used Genesis 2 to emphasize marriage is permanent. So let's go over to Matthew chapter 19 now. There was a question that Jesus was asked in Matthew 19 and in verse 3. The Pharisees came to Jesus tempting him, and they asked him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife just for any reason? Can you get a divorce for any reason? Can you just get a divorce for multiple causes? Can you do that? That was the question. I want you to notice what their question was. Their question was not about divorce and remarriage. Their question was about divorce. Can you get divorced just for any cause? Now then, beginning at verse 4, Jesus gives his answer pointing back to Genesis 2 and verse 24. Have you not read that he which made them at the beginning, made them male and female, and then he quotes Genesis chapter 2. So Jesus is telling me that Genesis 2 is the answer to that question. So what did Jesus say in answer to that question? Listen to this carefully. Several commentators go to Matthew 19 and say Jesus avoided and skirted the issue. And that is, they are looking for Jesus to say either yes or no, and we never saw the word no, and we never saw the word yes. And they say he skirted the issue, and I beg to differ. He did more than answer the question. He gave the reasons for his answer. He gave 4 reasons why you cannot get a divorce just for any cause. What was his reasons? Here they are. Notice beginning at verse 4. Have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? In other words, God, number one, made one man for one woman for life. If that's true, can you get a divorce just for any cause? His answer is no. Can't do that. Why do you say that? Because God made one man for one woman. Second reason. Let's read further. Look at verse 5. For this reason shall a man leave his father and mother and be joined or cleave unto his wife. It's a word meaning to glue to. More about that in a moment. Mates are to cleave to each other. You can't cleave to each other and divorce just for any reason. I'm going to divorce you because I don't like you anymore. I'm going to divorce you because I don't like the way you cook. I'm going to divorce you because I don't like the way you dress. You can't do that and cleave to one another. So his answer, secondly, is no. Here's a third reason. Notice he said the two shall become one flesh. Do you know one is the only number you cannot divide as far as people are concerned? I know you can take the number 1 and you can divide it a million ways, but not when it comes to people. They're one flesh. And if they're one flesh, they're inseparable. And then the fourth thing he said at verse 6, what God has joined together, let not man put asunder. So Jesus' answer to the question was no, 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 no. 4 times. And if you want some more no's, Paul gives 4 no's in 1 Corinthians 7, 10 to 12. No, 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 no. And yet we ask some of our own brethren today, can you get a divorce for a cause other than fornication? And some will say, I don't see anything wrong with that as long as you don't remarry. When Jesus said, no, 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 no. And Paul said, no, 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 no. And some brethren say, I don't see anything wrong with that. I have a hard time harmonizing those. Jesus said marriage is a permanent relationship. But let's go further. Furthermore, number 6, I'm learning from Genesis 2 that marriage involves commitment. Marriage involves commitment. Notice at verse 24 of our text in Genesis 2. If you've left there, let's go back to Genesis chapter 2 and look at verse 24. Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother. God's law on marriage involves leaving father and mother. That doesn't mean they don't have a relationship with them, even a close relationship. They very well may have a relationship and should have. As 1 Timothy 5 would so argue. But that's not the primary relationship. Now, she's now first and foremost in his life instead of his parents. The couple are committed to each other, not committed to their parents. Furthermore, a new family has begun. As this marriage has begun, a new family has begun. And as the new family has begun, headship and leadership has changed, where the father may have been the head over the woman, and the father may have been head over this man. Now the young man is the head of the new family. He's the new head. God gave him that role, Ephesians chapter 5. But furthermore, the text says a man should leave his father and mother and be joined, or the King James says cleave unto his wife. That word, according to the lexicon, means simply to cleave, to adhere to, especially firmly, as if with glue or to be glued. Now you stop and think about that for a moment. When you glue something together, you put it together to glue it because you intend for it to stay, not that you're going to take it back apart. You may bolt something together that you can take back apart. You Velcro it together to take it back apart. But gluing suggests some permanency. You intend for it to stay. The word from which we get the idea of gluing is this word being joined. A man leaves his father and mother and he's glued to his wife, which tells me that there is commitment involved, that you've joined in this relationship because you're committed to that relationship. It describes an inseparable relationship. You see, in marriage, you are making a commitment to each other as well as to your God. There's a commitment to each other. Marriage should be built on a relationship you have with God and a commitment you have with each other, and not on the attractiveness or the romance. Because I want to tell you that attractiveness and that romance may change with time. It should be built on a relationship with God and a commitment you have with each other, not be built around the children. I want to tell you, I've seen many marriages that were built around rearing the children. The children grow up and they leave home, and then the couple have nothing in common with each other. They have no common bond. The children are gone. There is a commitment to one another. But finally, marriage demands unity. Marriage demands unity. I learned that right here in Genesis chapter 2. Where do I see that? Well, look at verse 24. They shall become one flesh. What is that? Well, that obviously involves the intimate sexual relationship. Every commentator will make that observation. And some leave it at that and stop at that. But I'm convinced it involves much more than that. And why would I say that? Well, let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 6. 1 Corinthians 6 is not even talking about the marriage relationship. He's talking about something that should take place in the marriage relationship. But what's the context? Some were committing the sin of fornication and seemingly trying to justify fornication from the standpoint that just as you satisfy the hunger of the body with meat, you ought to satisfy the desires of the flesh with fornication. What's wrong with it? And so Paul is arguing against fornication. Flee fornication, verse 18. But now back up at verse 16. Do you not know that he who is joined to a harlot is one body with her? For two, he says, shall become one flesh. But he's not saying a man joins himself to a harlot, he's married to her. Some have argued that. That's not what the text is saying. But what he is saying is, in this intimate relationship they have, there is more than the sexual relationship. There's a blending of their personalities and their lives together, is what's going on. So what I'm learning from 1 Corinthians chapter 6, it involves the uniting of the mind and of the body. This is a spiritual union they're having. In this marriage relationship, they should be one in goal, one in aim, and one in purpose. It's more than having that intimate relationship that's involved in the one flesh, but they're united because they're one in goal and one in aim and one in purpose. There's a uniting of their minds as well as their bodies. It's a bonding with each other. Now, it's interesting to me, while we're talking about this unity demanded in the one flesh, it wasn't until sin entered that they started pulling apart. Now, in the next chapter, you'll get to that next week, I think, chapter 3. But as you get into chapter 3 in your studies in Genesis, what you're going to notice, it wasn't until they sinned when Eve partook of the fruit, then she invited Adam to take of the fruit, and when he ate of it and God caught him at that, That's when he started pointing the finger of blame. That woman that you gave me, she gave it to me, and I ate thereof. That's when they started pulling apart. And what I want to tell you, it's when sin enters our families, in our homes, and in our marriage, that's when we start pulling apart and pointing fingers of blame. Marriage demands unity. The very order of creation suggests authority and submission. That has everything to do with unity. You see, Adam was created first, wasn't he? Because God said to the man, it's not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him. And he did. You say, what does that got to do with anything? Well, let's turn to 1 Timothy chapter 2. Go to 1 Timothy chapter 2 and look at verses 11 and 12. In saying that women should learn in silence and all submission, and I do not permit a woman to teach over a man or have authority over a man. Notice he said, for, verse 13, Adam was formed first, then Eve. The order of creation tells us something about authority and submission. Now, when that authority and submission, when she takes the role of authority and he takes the role of submission, or he takes the role of authority and she's not willing to take submission, when it's all out of kilter, there is no unity in the marriage relationship. The very order of creation suggests unity in authority and in submission. Well, what have we seen tonight from Genesis chapter 2? Perhaps there's more. There's a lot to be learned from Genesis chapter 2 about marriage and the home and the family. But here's what we've learned, that marriage is divine in origin, God's idea to have marriage. It was his. Marriage is good for mankind. It's good to be married. Marriage is heterosexual. Marriage is monogamous. Marriage is permanent. Marriage involves commitment. And marriage demands unity. They are indeed one flesh. There may be one or more present this evening who's not a Christian, who's not a child of God. Instead of thinking about the marriage relationship that you have with the husband or the wife, we need to think about our relationship with the Lord, which is described as a marriage in Romans 7. Are you joined to the Lord? Are you married to the Lord? There's a sense in which we're joined and married to Christ. When we become Christians, we obey the gospel. Would you do that this very evening? Would you come this evening believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? Would you repent of your sins, acknowledge your faith, and be buried in the waters of baptism for the remission of sins? If you're subject in any way, would you come? All together we stand and while we sing. His word.